new councillors and all the councillors have joined us. My name is Kasim Ali. I'm the Chair of Housing and Communities Select Committee. So do welcome everyone. I also like to tell you that this event is streamed live on YouTube so that the members of the public and the media can watch remotely and listen to the discussion as it's taking place. We used to do this meeting before at the council chamber during the COVID, but now we've moved to the committee room 1 at Kensington Town Hall. So those of us who are watching on YouTube should probably realize that the format is slightly different. As you're all aware of, we start with our meetings, housing and communities, because of the disaster that happened in Kensington and Chelsea, and it was a housing disaster, as well as it had effect on our communities. So we should start with 72-second silence. Thank you all. The first item of our agenda, item A1, is the membership, the chair and the vice chair of this committee. Does the committee note the membership of this committee, the vice chair and the vice chair? The chair and the vice chair as agreed on the 25th of May at the council AGM. Agree. Thank you. The next agenda item is A2, and apologies. I do have one apology from Councillor Claire Simmons. Any other apologies? Answer is no. We all hear most of us. So thank you. Third one, declaration of interest. Anyone to declare any interest? I take that as a no. A4 is the minutes of the last meeting. That's 17th. Some of the notes you may have may say 17th of February. Apologies for the typo. I've been notified later, and I've also informed the officers. So 17th of March 2022. Great. If you agree that, we're happy to find that. Thank you.
I know they're not my minutes, but I just note that there's a typo on page 5. And there were 2 points really. It talks about the viability of the programme, and it's slightly confusing because actually this was to do with the programme to acquire temporary accommodation. But it looks as though it's the new homes programme as the previous paragraph. So I was going to suggest maybe in the second line you just added in the temporary accommodation programme. And then on the line at one, it talks about officers added that between lack of housing. I think that should be not between, but because of lack of housing.
You know that. Excellent. Thank you for your contribution. That has been noted, and happy to sign up the meeting. 6.5, agenda number A5. This is an important agenda item. As you may well remember, housing, one of the areas that we look into the new homes program, and it's been rolling since 2019. Actually, my first meeting as the chair of this committee at the time had a slightly different name, was the new model or financial modeling for the new homes program, and it's continues and will probably continue for the end of this municipality year to look back again one more time, the changes, as it's more important this year than any other year before because of the inflation, because of the high costs, as well as Brexit and the war on Ukraine. Agenda number A5 is the housing and social investment, inflation and the cost of pressures. I would like to welcome Councillor Kinta, the lead member, and all other relevant officers to join him and to brief us, and then we will be able to do the lot of work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, just offering my own welcome to the new members of the committee as well. So really, as a very short introduction, I'm really just going to highlight two statements within the covering paper under paragraph 4, current situation. The first one under 4.1 is that the current capital programme, as currently scoped and budgeted, is unlikely to be deliverable in the medium to long term. And that really does reflect where we are at the moment in terms of the cost pressures that we are seeing now, getting tenders coming in, obviously, which were originally assessed, and the tenders are coming in at prices significantly higher. And we're obviously amazing how a year changes and where we are now in terms of inflation. So the part of this report really is to do with the fact that we are under a lot of pressure. The second relevant part is that the programme is currently being reviewed to consider what measures we can take to bring these programmes back into a deliverable position. And that's something which we're currently working on. There are many levers that we can pull in order to look at doing that, and that's something which we're working through at the moment. And again, the paper itself goes on into a little bit more detail about what those things that might be considered. But I think it's probably best to, I'll look at my left and right, see if there's any additional comments that Dan or team has, but otherwise I'd suggest we put it back to the committee for questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Deputy Leader and the officers for the paper, and clearly a difficult problem that you've been landed with. Given that it's no longer a very propitious time to borrow as it has been over the last couple of years, that to do these programmes you need to raise capital. What thoughts have you given to selling assets, or either current assets or future assets, to raise capital in order to deliver the service to the residents that we obviously want to do, both in terms of good quality housing in the second programme and new housing, particularly social housing in the first programme?
Well, the short answer is that I think let's just look at it in terms of what capital receipts can we look at in order to mitigate our cost of borrowing, because obviously in terms of interest rates that is a threat to us, given that the programme and the new homes programme and the capital programme was predominantly being funded through borrowing. So in terms of potential capital receipts, there are capital receipts with regard to on the building programme on 106s and things like that we can look at as what might be available to support us. Beyond that, as far as I think specifically to your question in terms of capital sales, historically we've never looked at capital sales, but that's something which we're going to have to think about. And the capital sales will come in two ways. I mean, one, we have capital assets not necessarily relating to housing revenue account in terms of housing that we can consider. We can consider some of the commercial properties that we might have owned within the HRA, where they're let and they have a decent, reasonable covenant. That might be something we could look at, how we might sell some of those off on a longer lease in order to make capital receipts. I think the more controversial one, because we're in the business of delivering more homes to give more accommodation, is to look at some of our housing stock. You know, we do have standalone properties where, you know, they are of high value. They're older properties where the cost in terms of repair plus the cost of greening, which we're factoring in, would suggest to us that maybe an alternative than spending that amount of capital money to effectively not generate any additional revenue to the HRA, because you don't get any more in terms of rent as far as the rent is concerned. That might well be a consideration. But as I say, that for me is a bit of a last resort, but it's clearly we've got to look at everything in terms of capital monies. I'm just trying to think if there's anything I missed in terms of levers as far as mitigating debt that we could. highlight?
So there is just, we have looked at one of the options on the New Homes programme is that we have market rent, and whether there is an option to do market sale, but that would only offer an immediate level of receipt, and we would lose the long-term borrowing, the long-term rental income, which would be quite high for market rent, that would pay down more of the borrowing over the longer term. So that is not really a lever we can utilise. But we did have to test it out however much unpalatable it is, we have to test it to look at the outcome.
And in doing that testing, you have come to a conclusion then that it's not a viable, or it's not the best way forward.
It doesn't contribute. So yeah.
And I think the other factor of that, of course, is that these might be private rental at the moment, but by having them as private rental, it gives us the opportunity at some point when finances permit to enable to change that tenure. You know, the properties themselves are going to be tenure blind, so we could move it into a key worker, we could move it into social rent in due course. Once you've sold it, you've lost control.
Perhaps going back to your earlier point, Kim, about selling some existing properties, is it the case that you've got some that are so valuable you sell a handful of those, but then you can actually build a much larger number than you're selling of social rent because of the values involved?
Yes, I mean, there's an illustration in my own ward. Around the corner for me, there is a 3-bedroomed terraced house in Chelsea that's currently, tenanted. Obviously, one would, and if that was to become available, the value in that particular street for a property there was probably £2.5 to £3 million. So it's a Victorian building, which is pretty inefficient. So the capital cost of refurbishing that and more importantly, greening, putting in sealed double glazed windows in order to meet our carbon commitment, again, would be considerable. So if you look at that and then say to yourself that when you're reletting that property, you would still be only getting 3-bedroom home. I'm sure you could quote what that would owe. It's £150, £160 a week. Economically, that's doesn't work. I think the only thing to mention on this, and it's not related to this party, for this paper, is that is a real fear that I have with our registered providers, because all of our registered providers are currently looking at their asset management strategy, and my fear would be that they would be coming to that same conclusion. And some of our long-established registered providers that we have within the Royal Borough, they've got a lot of standalone single properties, and that's something which we're obviously going to have to keep a very close eye.
Thank you. I will come back to you. In terms of the properties you've mentioned, the difficulties because of the cost of living and current situation. I've asked the officers before, and I don't think anyone can give me an answer. Is there any chance that we set the New Homes program, the social rent, so the 50%, some of them will be lost for the key workers? Is there any comment on that?
Well, we've given, our programme is 600 with a minimum of 50%, and we want to stick to that. We don't want to come back to this committee and say we can only do 45%. So that is really what we're looking at doing, is how we can deliver that minimum of 50%. Maybe somewhat optimistically now, I think when we went into the programme, I thought to myself, well, if things ease in any way, we can maybe increase above that 50% across the programme, if finances allowed us to do so. I think that's going to be quite hard. I think the challenge is going to be us making sure that we do deliver on our 50%. There's not going to be a lot of fat there. And clearly, I think has already been highlighted, the principal driver of that is borrowing. We've got to be very careful in terms of the amount that we're going to be borrowing and what the exposure that then creates to the council.
I have one more question, and then I will open the platform. 3 sites that I would like you to give me an update on. Barbary Road, 83 properties has been talked about, and the date for is 2025. And the second area is Eaton Way. It's been closed. I would like to have an update on that. And finally, Jenny Nursery, which has been stopped three of these different sites, please, can you update on us?
So Barby Road, that we now have planning permission, and we're at the process of now going out to tender to get prices on that, and we'd like to sell that as quickly as possible. So that is very much within the second phase as far as the development is concerned. Cheney is not happening for the simple reason that the nursery is no longer required, and the family services have come back. They've made alternative arrangements for the violet melching in terms of where the children are going to be accommodated, so there isn't a need for a nursery. And given there's not a need for the nursery, and it really was a nursery project with some housing on the top, it's just not going to be viable for us to build. That doesn't say that at some point, we could look at it as an overall site again, but as it stands at the moment, the nursery is happy where it is, so there's no change. Edenham is one where, as a result of the pause, we have obviously lost the grant money. I mean, that's about £5 million. We obviously had a scheme that we felt was viable, but that's as far as the local residents are concerned in terms of housing numbers. And the configuration and the debate that we had between whether or not you have a tall building and lots of open space or lots of lower buildings, that is a process that we're going to start again. And in order to do that, we'll have another consultation with our residents to try and get to a position whereby we have a consensus in terms of what needs to be built there. But because of the size and because of the loss of the grant, it's now sort of effectively, they're easier sites for us to deliver on than Edenham, and I think it's going to be a longer discussion with our residents.
With councillors joining us, I think it would be good to start with your name and the ward you represent, since you're quite new to the housing and communities. Councillor Ross.
So, yes, my name is Councillor Mary-Therese Rossi, and I am a councillor for Redcliffe Ward. So what I'm really asking for is an assurance, really, not so much questions, but, and I think Dan did make this very clear in the briefing, but not everyone was there. So with the cost pressures, cost of living, inflation, difficulty in getting materials and labour and etc., can you give us an assurance that both in the new homes and in the refurbishment of estates, that you will not kind of cut corners and lower standards in order to actually be able to deliver the same things cheaper? So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think as far as safety is concerned, absolute cast iron guarantee that we're not going to compromise on safety as far as our buildings are concerned. That's paramount. In terms of when you talk about cutting corners, I think we have to go back and we've got to look again in terms of our specification, things like kitchens, white goods, etc. That's going to be something as far as it would be prudent for us to look at our overall costs as to where we could look to reduce some of those costs. But I think but just to be very clear, that wouldn't be at the expense of any risk or safety.
Okay, thank you. But you will look at, I suppose, the materials.
We'll have to look at all sorts of things in terms of materials, etc., but not ones that compromise safety.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Gard.
Hello, Joanna Gardner, Pembridge Ward. I've got two questions. One is the occupancy of council premises. Have we, since the return from COVID and pandemic, have we actually looked at our occupancy? And indeed, whether we've got any council premises that we could look at renting out if we reconfigure where services are run? And secondly, which is complete curveball, is Project Union. I'd be very interested to hear more about it. It's mentioned in one of the papers, and it talks about efficiencies. And I wonder whether that's also looking at giving you savings as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably.
So yes, we had a home visiting team that we set up after we took on the management of the dwellings, and that job is to ensure a number of things, that people are living in property safely, that their any vulnerabilities are managed, also they're the right people that live in property, and that's supplemented by a housing investigations team, which where people aren't living in property, there will be it's a criminal offence to sell that property, so we have a team that looks at that. But that's the driver for that is not for us to sell accommodation at the moment or look at repurposing it, it is because also we've got an awful lot of people in temporary accommodation, which has an impact on the general fund and the savings that need to be made there. So the driver is to recover properties from people who are misusing them where they are. Most people aren't. To be fair, most people, most council tenants are absolutely fine. But there's, in any walk of life, there'll be some people that aren't. And what we do is we get those properties back and then they get re-let because we've also got a cost pressure there. In terms of
I confess that actually my question was aimed at council officers.
Oh, shall I
But I'm very happy with
So my team manage the commercial estate, which delivers revenue to pay council services. We also have operational estate. What we are doing as a result of changes in working approaches because of the COVID pandemic, we're currently going through a process of mapping and reviewing all of our assets to make sure that we are, the phrase is sweating the assets, so that we're making sure that they are being used to their full effect. We are looking at it being led by the building and not by the service need, because there are a level of services that say, I'd like to be here, but actually, do you need to be there? Or do you need to be, it's what is led. And also looking at how we can utilise some of the existing assets that may be underused, such as libraries, and whether that could be a level of, not co-working space, but council office space, so the council staff can get out into the community a bit more. So it's quite a long-term programme that we're looking at our overarching asset management strategy, because in the background we also need to look at what those assets are costing us, and whether it is the best use of our existing resources, or whether we can actually use those resources in a better way.
Can I just sort of add it, because Anna's already done an initial paper where we're looking at our office accommodation in terms of the numbers of desks we've got. Clearly now post-COVID, we're trying to assess in terms of what that need would be. We're currently running at about 50% occupancy as far as the council staff is concerned, which is ahead of, I think, the London average of 30%. But we need to consider as to where best those offices are doing. I mean, Doug runs a model whereby we have within housing management satellite offices, and that gives local presence to people. I think that works quite well. I think the model that we're doing on Lancaster West is a really interesting model. It's quite expensive. So I think that whole issue of offices we'll look at. But where we've got surplus space, then what we need to do, and particularly given our cost pressures, is to use the expression, as the saying you have, is sweat the asset. And a good example of that is that we've got a company that's applying for planning permission for our car park here. It's a car park that's very much underutilised, and we believe that we can, as part of our greening, take away part of that car park, still having some. And that can, this particular company does self-storage workspace for small enterprises, and I think there's going to be a catering training facility.
It's a hospitality training academy. We're going to link in with, I think it's Yo Sushi and Kensington Roof Gardens, as it may be. But it gives us a level of, and again, it goes back to social investment, which is looking at our assets and how they can derive benefit for the wider community. So that's kind of lots of different options we're looking at along the way.
Yes.
You want to?
Yes,
please.
So we're giving it a name because in essence this creates buy-in across the staff to try and deliver, and it's really the procurement of a framework contract for our capital programme delivery for the refurbishment of our properties. We went out for a framework initially back in 2018 with mixed success, and therefore what we've been doing for the projects we've been delivering is single tenders. And with that, you have all the project costs that go with that individual on each project. So this is about making efficiencies in terms of your project costs, but also it helps you build a much longer relationship and a better relationship with your contractors that are on the framework, and gives us a sort of more assurance in terms of the standards. Because at the moment we've got 20 odd projects on site, we've got a multitude of different contractors. Some you build relationships with and you know what standards you're going to get. Others you have to manage closer. When you've got lots and lots of different ones in it, you have to manage everything super close and make sure that you're getting what you need. Ultimately, it's all about the quality and what you sign off at the end. And we've got levers for that. But the reason it didn't work last time was, as I said in the briefing earlier, it was a briefing that we couldn't have picked a worse moment than this to. There'd been a change of prime minister, and there was a view of a hard Brexit happening about a week after the tenders were due back. So lots of risk was priced into it, and it made the tenders unaffordable at that time. But in any event, the mechanical and electrical framework that we've got at the moment is coming to an end, so we're going to have to be procured. That's what it is.
So can I just challenge you further? I mean, are we not in a worse scenario?
We may be.
Because oh, we are. Challenge.
Absolutely, but we will know that when we've tendered. I mean, we're expected to go out at the end of the year. If it's still looking at that way at the end of the year, we might want to pause, and we've got a plan B, which is to continue with individual tenders, and we're getting on with some of those. But you're right, we may pause that. It's not just the contractors; it's quite a wide range. It's all the consultants as well.
I think just to add, so there is something that was probably different from the hard Brexit, which is there is a level of desire in the construction industry for a level of long-term certainty, which you get from a long-term relationship. Whereas I think there was more unknowns at the time of hard Brexit, whereas now there's rising costs, but I think the level of long-term relationship is something they're looking for, because that does give a level of certainty. We're experiencing that in the new.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor.
Yes, Lloyd North from Camden Ward. Our rent increases are 4% this year. Are we confident that that is enough to sustain the budget strains that we've got at the moment? And our second question is, what can you reassure us with our estate management that we're helping tenants that are in difficulty? What are we doing to help them?
Well, let me start with initial and I'll hand over to Doug. Is that, 4% works as far as this current year is concerned. But we're now running with inflation of 10%. And we're also looking at potential of significant increases in terms of utility costs. And Doug will talk about the support that we're doing on there. So we're under a lot of pressure at the moment. I think it's difficult for us to crystal ball to see how it's going to run out for the rest of the year and how that might impact in terms of overall what we plan to look at in terms of future rental increases. But we're in choppy waters. But in terms of support, Doug, do you want to?
So we have a number of teams whose job it is because sustaining people in tenancies is exactly what we want to have happen. So if debt starts to appear, and there has been a slight increase in recent months, and we think it's related to the problems that are happening at the moment. If we just went for a process which just said, right, we're not paying rent, we're going to evict you, which A wouldn't be the moral thing to do, but also wouldn't be our money. So financially and morally, it's not the right way to approach things. So what we've been doing is we've been working with our residents around three main areas. So we'll work with people who where we can try and maximise their benefits. So we do a benefits check and try and understand, are there things that aren't being claimed for. We have an employment team because employment is a way out of this, and so that works in two tranches. It's about getting people to be job ready in the first place, and then try and get people into employment. And pre-pandemic, we were doing very well on that, sort of 70, 80 people a year. So during the pandemic, it was a lot harder, and it started to pick up again. And there's also debt counselling, so people who get themselves into debt, we can work with them in terms of maybe helping them budget, but also there are occasions when we will advise them pass them to independent advice, and they will manage their debt. We're a creditor like everyone else. That's probably a last resort for us, because ultimately we were happy to enter into an arrangement so people can always pay back their rent on a regular basis. But actually, we're not in a position where we can't say you can't pay your rent, and that's the difficulty I think we're going to have as that ranks up. So if you go back many years, it was about people who wouldn't pay. It was people who are struggling who can't pay. So that's the different dynamic. And I think if there's anything that COVID taught us is that we can work closer with our residents, because actually we were able to keep our arrears at the right level. In fact, they went down a little bit. We didn't have to take any punitive action in terms of eviction. So that's what we want to continue to build on. But I think things are going to be a lot more difficult for our residents.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just clarify, what kinds of services we provide in-house? I'm a
Yes.
trustee of James at the borough, and they do employment teams for, and I know they use something like Crosslight for debt counselling. So I'm just wondering, is it appropriate that the council provides those services? I mean, as opposed to putting in touch
So-
with the external community.
Well, I suppose it's how important is your income to. So as a director, I think I need to get the income in. So what's it worth me investing to make sure I get 70 million a year? And for me, having so they sit within the income collection team. So they become part of paying your rent, if you like. So they're not like a separate. It's about the tenancy sustainability. And for me, that works, because if I end up having to write off quite a lot of money, that becomes a deficit to the HRA, and that's what I need to avoid. So that's my
Yes, Councillor Wood. Councillor Wood.
Hi there, I'm Councillor Lane, Queensgate Ward. Just a couple of comments before my questions. First of all, in relation to the economic background, you say the COVID-19 pandemic falls all construction across the country. In my view, that should be COVID restrictions falls construction. That was what falls construction. And I note in paragraph 1.5, you do refer to COVID restrictions. You say following the relaxation of COVID restrictions. So that can just be consistent in reports from now, where there's policy that's prevented construction, that's COVID restrictions rather than the virus itself. Second of all, in reference to the cost and supply of materials being due to Brexit, in my view, that's a global issue. I'm sure they're having the same discussions on the continent. In relation to, you mentioned yes, supply been reduced because products have been sold to EU countries before exporting to the UK. You don't have to provide me an example now. You can send it to me after the committee. But could you please give me an example of an RBKC development having been negatively affected due to a product being sold to an EU country for the UK, with Brexit cited as the reason by the supplier? If I could have an example of that, that'd be great. Because if points like that are included, I think they should have evidence behind them. In terms of just my question, I note in the final final sentence, paragraph 4.3, you say you will at least have to consider some more challenging options, for example, reprofiling, delaying some works, changing the scope of works, or pausing or cancelling some projects altogether. My question is whether the decision maker is making the decision of which challenging options to pursue, what criteria does he or she consider, and what scope is there for local residents to influence which decisions made? My thinking behind that question is that if a development is of a very high quality, it may be worth delaying or pausing that development rather than lowering the quality of the development so it can be delivered on time. And local residents should have some sort of input in terms of which options taken.
So I think that comment related to both the capital investment programme as well as new build. So in terms of what we're trying to do on the new build programme specifically is we know we have a commitment to deliver 600 homes, and we are in trying to deliver that commitment. So I did put some figures in the report. If we are pausing a scheme where we've consulted already, we will go back to the community and we will have a conversation with them. If we haven't actually started consulting on the scheme, then, you know, there would be a different approach to it. But as Kim noted, when he was referencing Edenham, because we paused it for different reasons, we would be going back to the community, but it would be over a longer period of time. Doug, I don't know whether you want to talk about the capital programme.
So within this, we are refreshing our business plan to ensure that we take account of all these variables.
Can I stop you there 1 second? Before you go into the capital program, I just want to finish with the homes program, the new homes. So, yeah, just 1 second. The point that Councillor Gardner mentioned is really important. You talked about this relates to empty homes or homes that people are re-renting or office space. I think the question was office space and the equivalence of office space. You've answered that in relation to tenants who may be re-renting their properties. And I would like to challenge a bit further. What we understand, and this committee understands, that if a tenant tries to re-rent the council property, it's absolutely criminal. And I don't think courts will deal with them. And this committee agrees that we have a number of people, almost over 2,000 in temporary accommodation outside of the borough, and they deserve to be back in the borough rather than getting people who will rent it. That's absolutely something we can categorically agree. How about if officers somehow do not take into account when they have been informed by somebody who lives with them, or let's say with a tenant, they've given the details, they've given even the ID of the person that lives with them, but officers decided to ignore all that evidence and they informed, because they have the right to inform the council. And officers decided to ignore all of that and accuse the tenants, council tenants for this matter, that they are renting the property. What system do we have in place to hold our own officers accountable if they are wrong and accusing rightful tenants doing the right things?
Okay, so we have a number of levers. So before we go to court, it needs to be signed off by a senior manager. So they need to understand what the basis of the case is. And ultimately, going to court is an expensive thing. So if we lose, we will have to pay everyone's costs. And if we've got an officer that is doing that and not got the right end of evidence, and it has got through management and the manager's not, and that will soon come to the attention of myself, because I'm the budget for the legal services, and that would be wrong with us. And we do get a number of cases which are borderline, where certainly within families sometimes, where actually, you know, the tenant isn't there, but they've got access to lots of checks, and we wouldn't usually divulge the evidence that we've got. So we may know, for instance, that someone owns another property elsewhere, and those sorts of things that we may know, which we wouldn't necessarily may not always be apparent to members or to others, but we would keep that probably close to us. So those sorts of things do have those checks, and so ultimately my team, that would be Bernadette Fry, that would have the overview of that. And I don't want to be, I don't want to put people through it if they don't need to, and second, I don't want to be wasting public.
Can I just chip in also, just one thing you said, is that the fraud is not just in our council homes, it's also in our temporary accommodation. You know, where we're renting homes, and we've got a case which I think has just gone through, where somebody was effectively renting their home and they were being held. You know, so and then we will recover in terms of any monies that they have benefited from that. But it's something which we have invested in additional people to come in to actually look at that. It's something which we haven't been as proactive as we will be now, because at the end of the day, as you highlight, we've got a lot of people waiting to get into homes, and we need those homes for the right people.
I agree, and just to finish off with that point, you've made the case of going to court and everything else. But what about if an officer completely ignores evidence that has been informed and everything has been there, but then giving the tenants a stressful time, let's say a period of 6 months, for example, somebody who's suffering from cancer, for example, and we know this committee does not talk about individual cases, and I will not mention any cases, but we are getting now across borough across the borough caseworks, and I would probably do it private, but I wanted to know what system in place for our officers to look after and to the well-being of our residents, so that they don't act in a way that the feeling that I'm getting, TMO like, where top-down management, where no one cares about the stressful life that you're in. It's just us telling you, extending the time and time and time, and continuous threat of taking to court without evidence. That's what I would like to answer specifically.
So I don't believe that happens, full stop. And often people will, because the evidence is looked at, and again, appreciate members may hear one side of the story. We wouldn't be able to divulge the full details of individual cases. We would not, and that's what I'm saying, that's why I've done it, we would not apply at the court if there was a case which we felt we were going to lose. That's really where we're at, because if we were based on the which is what I've just explained to you. Now, if we get a number of complaints about staff, which we do from time to time, then they are fully investigated. I look at those personally, not the complaints, but the overall picture of that. And we would deal with that accordingly under our code of conduct, because that's where it sits. But just when it comes to fraud, often the people that you may get come to you as casework will say one thing, and the reality, I'm just saying this for
of course,
I've been doing it for 35 years. The reality is completely different. Not in all cases, and you know, if there's a particular case you want to look at, counsel, I'm more than happy to do that. But there's always two sides to the story, and ultimately we would keep our powder dry if someone's refusing to because if someone's subletting, they can unsublet, or they can come up with a different, or they can sell assets, or they can do things past being. What we're actually saying is we want the property back, because we want to give it to someone who's in need of it, not someone who isn't in need of it, and that's really where we're driving. So I'm more than happy to, if this is something.
That's fine. No, absolutely.
I'm happy to bring it.
You've answered my question, and absolutely, if there's any further details, we will be
Finished answering this gentleman's
Please
question.
finish. Yes.
So just to say so we will consult with our residents in terms of the dilemma we've got. So, and that will actually will start at the resident. We've got the resident event on the 9th of July. Everyone's welcome. It's on the Saturday in the Great Hall, where I think we'll be doing a bit of a double act in terms of setting out what some of those issues are that are coming down the line. But residents also want to hold us to account in terms of various other aspects of the service that we're delivering. But one of those would be the start of this conversation about what do we do, what is the approach. So there are you can extend the capital program for a longer period. You can modify the specification. You can sell out. There's all sorts of things that you can do. We're not reaching a conclusion on our own. We are looking at all of them. So behind that is the financial modelling of what we're doing. So you put models in that when interest rates go up, if your rent doesn't go, if your rent is lower than you're increasing costs, which it's likely to be, but you've got to model that in many different scenarios. Roughly what the scope of any possible deficit is. And that's the exercise we're doing, but we haven't done it, so we can't come back and tell you that. And that's what we'll be doing and coming back here.
But it's also important to say, kind of in answer to part of the question, Councillor, that so those decisions about those kind of decisions, including potentially some of those difficult options, decisions that ultimately be taken by the members, and the kind of, if you like, you asked what are the criteria by which they'll be made. There's a number of factors, and probably the weighting given to the different factors will ultimately be the judgment of the members. But we will give advice on a range of things, including the cost implications and what's within the affordable envelope. We will certainly feed what we know about kind of resident opinion, preferences and priorities. We'll obviously factor in the priorities that the administration themselves have already identified. Plus, of course, and that's partly about kind of the headline commitments like delivery of new homes, but also, of course, the priority on safety, for example. So where we were looking at, for example, reprofiling the investment of existing stock in Doug's area, or potential changes that we were talking about earlier to the scope of the new homes, there'd there'd be some absolute fixes or some things that we knew would have to be in the early stage, and some safety improvements would clearly be in that list. As I say, so there'd be a range of those factors that we give advice to the lead members on, but in the end it would be for them to make decisions about how to weigh those factors in order to identify the options that they.
Councillor Khan.
Can I just ask, what's your timeline? I mean, when do you expect to make the decision, and is it going to come back here?
I think it probably won't be one single decision at one moment. I think it'll probably be. I would expect in terms of what happens next in the new homes programme, I would expect it's something probably over the next 3 to 6 months. My feeling is that for the investment in the existing stock, we're committed to a programme for the current financial year, and so we'll have to make a decision in the run up to the start of the next financial year. Is that fair?
Yeah, so we would usually bring something in January of the financial year, which sets out what we think the situation is and what we might need to do. But there will be consultation ahead of that, certainly with residents in terms of those aspects.
And my guess is that given the interest this committee has certainly had in the past in the new homes programme, that we probably expect to be giving you something like a running commentary every meeting on where we are.
I was just going to say it will be an evolving thing.
Because I think the final will be probably leadership team and medium-term financial strategy, yeah. But
I think yes, on that comment, as I've mentioned before, this is a continuation from 2019 onwards, and it could feedback in what we're now discussing as debating this evening, or scrutinizing, or looking into more details, or it could be in a form of a key decision. So perhaps we will both need to look into it, and when leadership is ready to make a decision. Now we've now covered the 2 items for this agenda item, the new program. Any further details you wish to add to the program? Any further information you want to add on the HR culture program? I just don't know just why I say to you, but if there's anything, perhaps I thought you were saying some more.
We missed anything? I think
we
pretty much answered.
Thank you. Listen, thank you very much for coming as ever, and looking forward to seeing you again.
And we look forward to visiting the new homes.
Oh yes, and we will look forward to visiting the new homes.
Yes.
The new homes.
Well, I went to the topping out ceremony in 2 of them, and the first one is likely to be delivered at the end of the year. So so yes, I think it'll be really good to go and see.
Yeah.
May I ask, Mr. Chairman, do you need us to work the programme?
Not necessarily.
Sure.
You've
We get let off for good behaviour.
No, you've been good. So, but you can go. Thank you very much. You will come back if
You got my mobile.
Thank you very much. We move on to the agenda item 6. This item is in response to the recommendation of the COVID-19 Community Recovery and Conference that we had the 7th of March. I remember the 7th of March 2022, and it's one way to do scrutiny, not only looking at the key decisions and also other meetings, but having a day of scrutiny is important. So we had that opportunity to do, and here we have a new lead member who is helping us getting settled. So Councillor Sof McRae, welcome to the Select Committee, and congratulations for your new role. We'd like to hear from you, and you know the recommendation and what's your take on it.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for having me here. Thank you for welcoming me. Yes, I am the new lead member for communities, but I am literally in this role for 3 weeks, I think. So this report was done quite a while ago, as you said. And apologies, it hasn't come before then. Partly that's due to the election. Way. And a lot of it talks about COVID, which COVID recovery program, but also very interestingly also about the Grenfell aspects as well. And I just want to say, I think the work that Scrutiny does is really important, and some of the question on this has been really insightful. So thank you. I know many of you weren't on this one, but I'm sure in the future people will thank you. So thank you for that. But I'll leave it to Nadine to say any more about it, or else just assuming, any questions you want to ask. Far away.
Yes, Nadine, welcome. I think you are here for 3 months on base.
I am,
Yeah.
yes. So,
Would you like to introduce yourself?
yes, so my name is Nadine, I'm the interim director of community. So, SOF has been here for 3 weeks, and I've been here for a couple of it, so we are relatively new. So, nice to meet you all.
Thanks. Thank you. Would you expect you've heard, and is there any recommendation that you feel needs to be looked at, or?
We've accepted all your recommendations, so, and I think that was really good. One of the ones that I thought was particularly interesting as well, there's a couple of things, because I'm really trying to get out of the town hall a lot more and actually go out in the borough a lot more and meet a lot of our fantastic voluntaries and sectors and our resident associations. And one of the ones here, it says, which I was very keen to add in actually when I read this, saying going to meet with Nottingdale Ward councillors and also extend that to all other councillors and Earls Court and other areas in the borough as well, definitely. I thought that was very interesting, and actually I thought recommendation 2 put back the needs aspect. I think it's recommendation 2, yes, and that's going on about the resident-led panel, and we've got a meeting, Lydia, haven't we, in July now with the Grenfell Projects Fund and the residents-led panel, and because there was quite a lot of concern about the way the first Grenfell Projects Fund was carried out, and learnings have been made for the second, and I think there's been quite considerable training, hasn't there?
Yes.
And I met a resident actually who was on the panel over the memorial of the fifth anniversary and of Grenfell, and she said it's been really, really, really interesting to be part of it. So I thought that was great to hear from the resident, and I think there's many more changes happening, I think, as well on there.
There is, and if I may just add, so Councillor is quite right, we have a meeting in July. As you're aware, in terms of the work that we do, we wanted to make sure it was community-led. Grenfell it was a local authority, and particularly in the context of the resident panel and the whole programme around GPF, what we wanted to ensure is that any projects that came forward through the GPF process, they were firstly in terms of needs identified by the local community, and secondly in terms of some of the priorities that the communities felt that were important to their lives. They were the priorities that we were supporting. In total, we are currently at a point where we are now currently signing contracts with respective organisations. However, what we want to ensure as we go forward, particularly in July, is we start thinking about some of those recommendations that you put forward in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, but also in terms of making sure that those organisations, they come together. We can start thinking about some of that collective resilience, and we start really promoting and celebrating some of those achievements. And in doing so, we believe that we really start driving that sentiment of community-led, but also at the same time, we then start really developing that ecology of local community groups, organisations, really leading on some of those issues that have affected communities themselves.
Thank you. I think we've.
Can I just
Apologies, Councillor, I'm sorry to break protocol, but my name tag wasn't here, so I didn't know if I could join. I've asked officers that I'm joining, so I'm also Khan, I work within the department, head of community participation.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to add to what has been said so far?
Just a quick note around the resident panel. More than actually things going well, I think we've developed some good relationships with the existing cohort of the resident panel members, and actually I think they felt that their job was done when the program had kind of awarded grants, but they actually want to stay on and continue. We want to carry on visiting organisations and seeing the delivery firsthand. I think that is a success actually, that we've developed this interest in them, and there's a good relationship with them that are going to continue staying on with us. So I think that's a good achievement, I would say. We've got a lot of work to do, but that's the only thing.
On today, I will start the question and then hopefully councillors can can contribute. On the day of the conference, what really was really great to see is the student residents' participation and the panel. I do recall a resident called Rihanna who contributed hours and hours of reading applications and spending at one point, if I roughly remember, maybe 6 hours or so, just to read through, read everything and make sure that everything is being done and all the things are being crossed. And I was really proud to see a resident that's taking all that initial on board. Having said that, the training that she and other colleagues have received or other residents panel members have received was not enough. What I've read from. I would like to know what you have in mind for that, and if anything for the future. It's unfair to expect a resident with all these hours on their time while they could have fulfilled other duties and perhaps to the hard times that we're in, the cost of living. Perhaps they could have earned that hours with someone else to pay their rent. Maybe if they're well off, then that's another story. Is there anything that you have in mind?
Well,
for
I'll definitely
residents?
take that on board, definitely, and find out more about the training. I think that's
I can add something, Councillor, if I may. So there's two things there, as you said. One is the training that they perhaps should receive more or better quality training.
More of it and sustained training, not
That's
just one off, because of the issue was they've received one off and they didn't have anywhere to go back to. So the sustained training so that they can get up to date with whatever the challenge is at the time. That's one. And the second one was
And the kind of recognition of their time.
absolutely.
I understand. So the first point around training and continued training and sort of sequential training. The good news is that they want to stay with us and we want to grow that cohort of PGAN. And so the company that we have enlisted to give us that training, WSA, I think they're called, they're continuing to stay with us as well. We've got the second round of the training program called Community Leadership Program, which we will be somewhat sort of rethinking, reimagining, because we've had a review of that program. That program is going to look at training, specific leadership program training for individuals, not just to the resident and panel members, but others. So we will want to integrate the needs of the resident and panel members into that program as well. And that program, we're right in the middle of, as I said, reimagining it. And the good news is WSA is still with us and resident panel members are still with us. So I think all of those pieces are still there. They haven't fragmented as such. So we definitely see that point and we want to strengthen it. The second point around recognition, so we definitely understand that some resident members or panel members will have contributed really a lot of work to this process. We've spoken to other boroughs, and it is actually sort of we're seeing there's precedents in other boroughs where their services are recognised. So I think we would want to take that away, I would say, and really consider it seriously. So that it's not just a voluntary thing, and 60 hours is a lot of time if you that amount. So I think it's definitely a case well made, and other boroughs are doing it. I think we would advise the lead member accordingly, but we would definitely take that back.
Thank you. I think that was the point that I needed to put across. Thank you.
Good. Well, just thank you very much. Just a couple of observations. I mean, firstly, I'll endorse everything the chair said about the evidence that she gave to us. It was very compelling, amongst many in a good day, but hers did stand out as speaking with a great deal of knowledge. I know she's a constituent of the chairs, but very compelling evidence and well worth listening to, I think, for the executive. I think it's quite easy reading this for the benefit of having been at the conference all day, which the chair and I were, and possibly Councillor Ross.
Yes, I was there.
I suspect it might be a bit more difficult coming in cold to those who are new to the committee and not really understanding the context of the answers which your predecessors have provided for you tonight. But for me, it was all self-explanatory. The only question I've got, there was one of them that was partially accepted, and my reading of that was it was partially accepted because of the wording of the question was giving you a duty that was actually not yours to execute and it belonged to another council department. Is that my reading that correct?
Can I come in on the
Please.
same one?
Yeah.
That I really, having been at the conference, it came up again and again and again. That people wanted to deliver food and they couldn't because they didn't have a parking permit. And okay, I know it's transport, but you know, I'm sure there's a way that it could be sorted out because it is going to get worse this autumn. Clearly, there's going to be much more demand for food banks, and you know, it's going to be very difficult for people. And I think just, I don't know, getting 10 permits or something would really help. And I don't see it that it's undoable. I mean, I think we should be able to do it.
Yeah, but I think the committee worded the recommendation as well as we might have done in giving you that problem, and I'll take my share of the blame for that because I've proofread the document for you, the recommendation. Went on, I didn't spot that one. But as Councillor Rossi said, really important the parking one. So we might have worded it that the council should do this as opposed to the member communities or whatever we worded.
No, I understand actually the importance of it, I don't think came across in the report. I've not been at the conference, so that's really good to hear that. So
you know, it was really, it came up quite a few times that people just couldn't deliver because, you know, they didn't have, you know, funds. So they just couldn't do it.
Okay.
I think you know what Councillor Rossi and Councillor Hammond said about this. The whole thing started, the discussion started about transport. The council actually providing transport itself, and then the council wasn't in the position to provide the transport itself, you know, vehicles and vans and so on. Then members of the committee actually suggested we actually can get our own transport, but it's the problem of parking, and I think that is how it came about.
We can take that up.
That is how it came about, and if necessary, we can help write letter.
Well, with virtual parking plans should be relatively straightforward, and
So-
it can just be on certain days of the week or whatever, with the providers and so.
It
That's
was absolutely, it was important for the food bank sector. Any other councillor? Since you were not there, you would be forgiven not having asked questions, but if you want to indulge, of course. I think that is straightforward, so we will take to the council meeting and we will speak on this agenda item, and thank you for accepting it.
Thank you, and just
Any
one,
comments?
well, just want to add about the cost of living, because I know that came up a lot in the previous housing section, and again, you're saying about, we are looking very much forward, we're not looking forward to, we are looking ahead to the challenges that will happen in autumn. And the council, I think, is actually trying to again kind of work across all the different departments. There's this chart that's being put together, and we're having a cost of living hub coming up very soon. It's going live next week. Thank you. And there is a lot of financial support available for our residents, but we need to make sure that everyone in the housing department knows how to signpost it to the others, and Councillor Gardner's point in the previous section about your local challenges and Clemens doing specific work. A lot of voluntary sectors do all communicate hugely well, because that's under my umbrella as well. But just making sure that the residents know it's there, and maybe, you know, council officers know it's there too. So we're doing a massive kind of meetup and something.
We are. Yeah, and so one part of my service kind of has stewardship over, for example, community grants, and we're quite clear in terms of who those services are and the services they provide to respective communities. And what we want to make sure, so this chart that sort of refers to, Councillor refers to, one key theme of that is to make sure that those services, where we're providing grant funding, providing services to the community, so it's not just actually a virtual hub, but it's also about recognising how the whole system operates in terms of meeting people's needs. I think it's also important to add that before we got to this stage, in terms of understanding how we need to actually target that support, there's been an awful lot of modelling work that's been undertaken. So what we've tried to identify is where the impact is potentially going to hit the worst. And in some cases, we've already responded in relation to those residents and making sure that they're actually getting the appropriate level of support. But in other cases, we still recognise that there is some further work to be done. I think it's also important that as we do this piece of work, we recognise where we are now. And we also think about, so for example, the conversation around, for example, inflation and the potential threat of recession, all of these kind of stuff. But also recognising that as seasons move, we're going to have different kind of pressures, i.e. winter pressures will bring a different kind of context, cost of living type issues. So we are on it, we are doing this piece of work, and what you need to do is keep looking at the data, keep looking at the intelligence, and making sure that all parts of the system can be accessible.
Thank you. I wish you well for the post as well. Thank you. Yes,
Back on
Councillor.
So one of the things, the Chancellor got quite a shock when he had a roundtable meeting, and the first payments were meant to be arriving on the 14th of July, and one of the residents turned around and said, I don't know anything about this, and he was shocked at that lack of knowledge for the people who need it most. How are we looking? Because I know the comms team love to rely on online, but I know, for example, at Clement James, we had done some research and only 30%, this was pre-COVID, only 30%, 38% had access to the device, and most of those were mobile phones. They didn't know how to do their banking online, probably don't know how to do. So they may have a smartphone, but they don't know how to use it, and they don't use it regularly for emails. I look after somebody, and very much I do all their emails. So if they have a housing association issue, they ask me, and they ask the housing association provider to me. So how are we getting over or away from pure reliance on online consultation? Because that doesn't work for all of the community, in particular the community that needs it most.
Can I jump in here? Because I think that's very valid. And just looking back to some of the ways actually that the Grenfell Project Fund was promoted, I think we'll probably be looking at those. So just looking back here, there's the Northgate News and magazine and notice boards in the States. But I think we probably need to make sure that messages through, not just relying on emails out to. I mean, we do really. This is another thing I'd really love to do is kind of engage ward councillors more, because you are our eyes and ears on the ground as well. And we really need to incorporate all your knowledge much more, I think, in some of the processes.
Yes, please. Karen.
Yes.
Just very brief, Councillor. I mean, this committee may want to look at the work of the Digital Exclusion Partnership, which the council heads up. So you may want to ask for some input. They're doing a lot of work across the borough with a range of partners and council departments, looking at the digital exclusion that exists in the borough and how that hampers the work. So it's something for you to look at in the future. We're not the experts in that, but we are connected.
I think we've called that before, haven't we? Digital exclusion. Yes, the communities we talked about it, and I think there was a number of residents that has been, especially disabled residents.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's specifically this committee or did we certainly discuss.
We discussed it as
It's worth reviewing.
I remember today presenting that later. But yes, I think you've said it absolutely right. It's important to work with the ward councillors. They know their locals better. I think, as Councillor Khan mentioned, I think working with the local councillors is the way forward.
Can I just ask,
Sure.
picking up on one point that Mr. Khan said, one of the things that I have found is that I've had residents who have engaged in the election campaign and actually, or indeed they've come to the ward surgery, and we then followed up, so given us an email, and they are now engaged, and in fact, just been commenting on your gate scheme or this or that. But one particular resident has said to me, my street used to have a very active residents association, but it's now just me. In fact, it's not even me, I just happen to be a member of it. How can we help residents to, down that street to cul-de-sac, I would like to do through City Living or some other project, something where we can write to everybody, but actually how can we help them physically set up a residents association? Because I think in the past we used to do it, and I think Councillor Hargreaves has flagged this before, but it is, how do we, it's not just one person. I want that 30 or 40 back in that street. I want them to be standing up and being vocal about things. I don't want to be their leader. I want them to lead, and I want to listen.
I mean, it's a potentially big subject. I mean, I definitely understand the passion in our residents' voices. I mean, 70% of our borough is conservation area. You understand why people are passionate about it, areas, and there's 40 odd conservation sort of areas in the borough. So I think City Living Local Life Council is definitely one of the ways to pull a lever, I would say. I think I'd have to admit that capacity in terms of providing support for residents association development and creation, if you like, other than Doug's team and the Iago, which supports tenants associations. The wider residents association support is a bit sort of weak in the borough, generally speaking. And we can review that. I don't want to speak for Nadeem or Councillor McVeigh, but I'm admitting that it's something that we could do better, I think. This is a whole, lots of associations which are sort of struggling a little, I think. But City Living Local Life, I have to say, is a ready-made lever. It's underutilized, if I'm honest, because in my other role, I'm the lead person for that. And we'd welcome another chat probably, Councillor, if that's okay.
I think the housing team is, as you mentioned, that and the other will be the right team to consult with, because they have been working with the residents associations, and some of them actually helped them to setting up. There are not certainly residents associations, but community groups where like one block or two or come together and form their own network. And I came across that through Jack's journal, so perhaps that already would be the right.
But again, if you choose this to be one of your things you want to look at, please just let us know, because actually we are looking at the exact same conversation ourselves.
Absolutely. No,
And I think another officer is looking into various ways of how we can support kind of gold standard residents associations.
I think that comes under the housing team. I think the housing team will take the lead on that. But we were happy to work with you if there comes, but yes.
I'm glad this actually came on conversation, but it's something that I think I've contacted Councillor Lane. We used to have a gold standard award, and we had lots of support for it, and it fizzled out. And I've literally just been dealing with a housing block that we own, that a resident association will sort out 50% of the problems that they have, and they're now going to council departments and taking up their time. So we'd like to support set up their own resident association, and it's a spitting distance from this building. And I think that would be great. And even if it wasn't something, obviously there's budgetary restraints, if it was something that we could give support rather than give cash to, so like model constitutions, examples of equality and diversity, inclusions in things like that, setting up their websites or having a central council website that they can have spurs off or a page on or a contact at. And then there's a lot of residents that are nervous about doing that. If they get the right support, I think they can. So I would definitely say Councillor Gardner.
Quick suggestion, Councillor North, and I've engaged with you before because I'm actually before you became a councillor. But the TPAS service, the Tenant Participation Advisory Service, is an online portal. You can suggest that to your residents and contacts for the time being. That portal does offer a range of advice and guidance, whilst we sort of prepare ourselves. But in the meantime, TPAS service could offer some potential.
And we did used to have it at the council. I remember coming here, and some resident associations that were nice and settled, they'd have their desk there in the mayor's parlour, and they would have their newsletters out and their poster boards out, and it was a great thing because you could go along and pick up ideas, and it's not a high cost thing. They were really good. Yeah.
That's a good idea.
I see it as a good collaboration.
I know. This is great.
So looking forward to the year. But thank you very much for coming. And yes, the report will come to the full council. Yes, on 22nd or 20th.
To the 20th of July.
20th of July.
I think it would be helpful, Chairman, if you could just ask the committee to
agree
that.
Yes. Yeah. I think we've agreed.
What's on the 20th?
The report, the recommendation that we've just talked about, the conference that we had the 7th of.
Yes.
7th of March,
Yeah.
We couldn't take it to the full council meeting because we have to get the lead members first of all to look at it and agree. So 2 months period, but now that's all done. I think finally we could agree to take it to the full council meeting. Agreed? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we conclude the report, did we want to stay for the work programme discussion?
No,
you don't.
No, you don't.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you're certainly enjoying the meeting, which obviously not the first time I've had, people want to stay along and enjoy the housing communities.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Ask about the actions tracker. Did you seem remarkably blank in the response box?
Any comments on that? Actions, yeah. How do we track the actions?
It means it hasn't been done.
We haven't had it.
It goes back to September 2021. 64.
For the first blank one, I think we had an answer to this, and I'm afraid I don't really, obviously before the election. I'm fairly sure we have an email answer to that.
I think it's just an old version. You can circulate the correct version.
Okay, this is the old version. Okay, thank you. Yeah, after the meeting, thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely. Now we're moving to item 7, it's the work program. And we have talked about before, the work program is the year is a program ahead. And this is the first meeting of the Housing and Community Security Committee, as you're well aware of, the second in the autumn. Councillor Graham, we did kick off with the work program. Anything interesting that we
Well, one thing leapt out to me immediately, and that's because we went to the members of the OSC, and I noticed that she's left now. The chair of the OSC has an aspiration that each of the select committees should do a session scrutinising the budget this year, explicitly or in some way. Is that likely to be agreed by the OSC? It's something that we would need to factor into our timing for the year, as something we would have to do at the appropriate time, I guess, in the autumn.
Greg, is there a budget working group this year?
Yes.
Has that been suspended?
There is a budget working group,
Okay.
but I think
We used to do it like the Star Chambers, is that the same thing?
I'm not really sure it's got enough form on it to answer that. But the impression I got was that the OSC chair and the OSC was generally minded that each of the select committees should do a dive into their subject matters,
relevant areas of the budget.
As part of the overall budget scrutiny, which we haven't done in the last 2 years because the OSC covered it and the budget working group did a deep dive in various areas.
And what we've done specifically was we looked into the specific area of budgeting, where it is the capital program, I think £477 million that repairs and everything that's needed required. We've looked at that on its own merit. We've also looked at the new homes program, £250 million. So we've and I think £2.9 million for the Grenfell recovery. So we looked at the budget not as budget as on its own, but we have looked into different areas and the budget has been allocated. I think what the chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee was referring to is committees that haven't looked at it, budget of others, and perhaps she could single them out and want the housing communities to be part of it. Which
that may well be true.
Yes.
But of course, there are a set of budget documents, and they do drill down into each area of the council, and we do scrutinise a couple of the lead members.
So where it would be is UCASM would go to the start. It's that not every member of the committee would look at the budget.
No, I think her view was
she wants every member.
No,
of
that's
the
what I'm saying. The way we did it before
Yeah.
is there were sessions on housing, sessions on this,
Yes.
but not every member of the. So
Correct.
this is a different way it comes to the committee.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. So I think we just need to factor that in, that we and the other committees will need to do that at some point as well, alongside the key decisions that we've already flagged up. And obviously the last time we discussed this was in a private meeting, and that led to the list of paragraph 3.4, which Al has helpfully set out, which I'm happy to endorse as an accurate list of what we discussed.
So,
and I would regard the year as not a success if we haven't been out and done some visits.
Of
I've been
course.
saying that for 2 years.
Finally, I've got a point to raise. What a point to raise. But let's finish with the budgeting point. I think I do agree with you with the budgeting side. And although we have fairly scrutinized all the budgets that are relevant to our committees, whether it's the community side or the different side of the housing. However, what the Overview and Scrutiny Committee chair wants to do is perhaps I think give us more in depth to look into the budget specifically, and maybe we could organize in the future. We can organize in the future one-off meeting, 2 hours. If we can all work on our diaries and get one session specifically on budgeting, and as close to the end of the year, the beginning of next year, that's when most of the budget becomes thick and heavy. And so I would recommend that we should look into that when the time comes. But still plan for whatever. What do you think of that?
It could be an option, have a special meeting.
Just an hour and a half, 2 hours meeting, because the budget on its own needs to further reading and get to know more about things that we do rather than Councillor Gaza. I believe you want to have say.
Completely agree with the meeting, but from my previous experience, it's not going to be available to this committee that early. It would most likely to be
No.
late January, really February.
January,
If it's coming to the, so it will go to leadership before it ever comes.
Depends
No,
what stage it is.
exactly.
I think we might see some spreadsheets in the office.
Midterm-
It
midterm
might be
budget.
January, it
And I
might be,
was
it might
thinking
be
if you go
early.
February, it might be more useful.
Well, obviously the later it is, the less input we'd have on it.
Yes. We normally start with the midterm budget, and then once we
And
know
also-
what's on midterm budget, that gives us hint of what's to come, and November, December onwards, so then we can expect January, even if it's February, so that we can have more of a say. Councillor Ross.
No, I was just going to, as they were saying, there's a lot of pressure on the budget. There might be changes. You know, normally the budget for this year is pretty much like the one, you know, the year before, but this year,
Please.
I think things might, certainly the new homes programme, I think might change.
I mean, it's like the autumn, the departments will be asked to produce what I would call options and enhancement options. I've forgotten what they're called in local government, but in the MOD, I know what they are. But options to make savings and enhancements to spend more money, and there's a whole range of those that we might be asked to comment on. What do we think of the impacts and the opportunities? And I know they do have they're called something different in local government, but that process happens annually, and that is normally available in the autumn, and that's probably an area where we can add value in that discussion.
Councillor North and Councillor Lane, any comments on that? A specific date in autumn or towards the end of the year?
No, I think that works.
Yeah.
Excellent, works for you. So we probably will come back to that, and hopefully we will get a date on that. That would be all fun to us. Any other comments on the new work program for the year? Any comments that stands out? The standalone items have you managed to look at? The fire safety as well as the cost of living and volunteer and community sector funding.
I suppose just in the light of the last discussion with Councillor McVeigh, is voluntary and community sector funding. I'm trying to add to the workload, but it sounds as if I am. Is that sufficient in terms of the community engagement element? Because all the rest of it's predominantly housing. But actually, should it be on resident associations or indeed on consultation?
Very good point, and I think that point will be good for Councillor McVeigh to answer, and perhaps that reminds me to say to the committee that we will have a meeting one-to-one with her, and to give her the year's plan ahead of the year plan program, so that we know what the priorities are for as a league member for communities similar to the housing, and we're just working out. And Councillor will give us some updates on that. Have you managed to book a date or?
No, I've had conversations, but it's not confirmed yet.
Okay. So can we get that sometime in July before the summer?
I'll try to get the confirmation with Councillor.
Even if it's half an hour, because at least we need to know their priorities so that we can ask the questions as well as the budgeting side of it. So please do try for both league members, housing and communities, and it could be a virtual meeting, so we don't have to meet with council.
I think
Competitive hubs.
the cost of living is going to be something that is going to come up, if not at every meeting, but it will. So I don't think we're too heavy on housing, because I think the cost of living will come up a lot.
It's going to be a running thing.
It is.
And actually, the refugee and asylum seekers, the last one is cross-cutting across the whole council. So there's a definitely community element to that as well as a housing dimension. So
I think what I was thinking is the autumn, let's say October event to be just the communities, many communities, the cost of living, the refugee crisis that we have, about 800 Afghanis, and some of them children, and hotels that they're living now, the different types of accommodation that we have been given. The Home Office now taking responsibility. So all these changes are done. Hawthorne probably have read the email that he sent. And I think the cost of living as well as the refugee crisis will be our next meeting, and that will be the top, and especially the cost of living because of the October price change and everything. So we will have that in the autumn agenda. But if there is anything else to point out on the work program, and of course the visiting, I won't say sightseeing, site visits, and make sure that the homes that built are quality enough, as Council Ross mentioned, no corners, no cutting corners, and make sure that the council does what's necessary for the safe health and safety, as well as providing a high level of Council Ross, you want to add to that point? Or?
No, I was just, I think Kim did concede that perhaps you're not going to get quite as nice a kitchen or bathroom, but he said they would not compromise safety, so that's the most important thing. But I think they will be tinkering with the budgets and getting cheaper things.
And of course, the size of the properties, the living room, and so on and so forth. Not boxes, that's not fit for human habitation. But yeah, I think we will visit.
Subject to
of course. Yes, absolutely.
Just on the programme, the Grenfell housing, we haven't done that for a while. I'm just wondering when you're thinking of doing that. Because it's actually, as we know, because we've been on the committee, quite a short paper, but there's more than half of the committee haven't got the assurance of what's going on, and I think we benefit from seeing that paper and a version of it quite relatively early.
I was actually thinking we had a commitment. I'll come to Council Process. We had a commitment of looking into Grenfell housing issues every other meeting or couple of meetings to make sure that we know what's happening on that front. And I think it's important. Perhaps the autumn would be a mixed emergency. The most outstanding agenda items, no more than 3, because we have to give time and do more than agenda items. So perhaps we will go for that. But I will keep you posted when the time comes. And yes, Grenfell, thanks for the reminder. Grenfell,
it's quite important. As we know, it's a relatively short paper, but it updates us on where we are with the rehousing programme and the actually re-housing programme, which will be underway this year as well for those who are going to have a second chance.
Of course.
No, that's the wrong way of phrasing it.
No, it's
about 20%. Might move again.
Process again. We will get an update. Council Process.
No, I was just saying, when you look at the housing for the Grenfell bereaved and survivors, it can be quite difficult because there was such a small number who are not in permanent housing now, and then there's another bigger number of people who were housed but want to move. The difficulty is always of not identifying people. So I think sometimes we get those reports, they don't really tell us very much because they have to sort of anonymise them.
But we can need to get numbers to say the numbers of households that have not been rehoused or moved or in temporary accommodation. I think that can specifically, without naming individuals, we can get the numbers and the figures and the percentages.
I think what we'll be told is that in the paper that the number that need to be rehoused or to be housed for the first time currently in temporary accommodation is less than 5 because they can't put a figure on it below that because of the risk of identifying. Now, I think some of us know how many households that is, or at least it was, of the original 201. But it's fewer than 5, but there's obviously other dimensions to it as well.
Thank you. I think it's clear that the committee wants to see the Grenfell updates. Of course, that we have a commitment before, and the cost of living, which is another one, and the refugees crisis in borough, and the safety, health and safety, and the education for the children. All need to look into. Probably this will be the 3 items for also meeting the earliest meeting that we have. Any other comments, Councillor North?
I think simply just to add to Councillor Hammond's comment about needs of refugees and asylum seekers having a very strong community element. I mean, we're talking about food insecurity at all. One of the things I know is that quite a few of the voluntary organisations or food banks at one point in time were put under quite a lot of pressure because many of the asylum seekers in the hotels didn't like the food being provided by the Home Office.
Correct.
So I think it's one of those issues where just as much as housing is also going to involve that community dimension as well.
Absolutely. I think then going back to where we said we need all the two lead members to be present, because that's why the communities and housing are one under our scrutiny committee, and probably will be invited back again.
Can I just add to that, because I actually work in a food bank in the borough, and I can definitely vouch for that. And I suspect that the autumn winter period is going to be even more of a pressure. We've noticed that our food bank a big surge in demand, and also actually a dip in some of our contributions from some of our regular retailers. Small fruit and veg store providing half what they have done. They've always been very generous in the past, but
they're worried as well.
They are, exactly, and they're managing their stocks better, and their margins have been pressed. So it's going to be a kind of super squeeze all the way around. And yes, the refugee, it was awful. It was also, in addition to that, it wasn't so much they didn't like the food, that some small places, I was saying, couldn't supply it, or they couldn't use, because of lockdown procedures at the time, they couldn't use the kitchen facilities. So they were coming to us to boil an egg in a teapot or a kettle. And you know, having tuna, you could have a ring pull or a pot noodle or something, things like that. So, but there's going to be an upward pressure on things like food, and as well as a lack of slack with supplies, as people become more or less willing to donate to these things.
Absolutely. And Councillor Rossi, you want to say something?
No.
Excellent. And I think it's important when relevant to the food banks, the number of mosques, churches, and the Gurdwaras and the synagogue that have been supportive and actually providing a lot of support that the council initially could not provide. That puts me to the question. I think we also need, as we did it back in 9th of February 2021. I do remember that day specifically because we had a number of food bank leaders to attend a specific meeting and really thank them, and it was really great. Thank you.
It's very good.
I think it's about time also recognise as the communities and as a housing community select committee the work of the faith groups have done. I've been going to faith groups as a trustee of now. I've been to visit this church. I've been to my own ward, St. Francis Community Church. With films over there, recorded videos to make sure that people are being given support in Easter holidays and others, and the Gurdwara. And the latest visit that I attended now was the synagogue in Holland Park, which I've never visited before. It was really delighted to see the number of amazing work that the faith leaders are doing. So as a committee, perhaps one of the visits we do could well be visit those places, those faith headquarters, and to maybe have one meeting with
alternative day, so we have more than one visit. So those of us that aren't available on one day can go on a different one. Something like in my first year when I was briefly on the Adult Social Care Committee, each councillor was, it sort of worked, each councillor was tasked to go to one of the care homes or institutions in the borough during the year and write a little report to the committee. I don't know whether people feel about that. It had some advantages because I went to Medea, which was a very nice visit, and I wrote a report and I had a really good time.
We used to do that, but I think going to the homes where they're, actually building the homes, I think probably most of us would want to go.
Yes, we would. Yeah, we need to go. For that, I think we need to go en masse. What about the fire safety though? We have different dates and we go to different.
Yeah.
Whoever's available, we go to different.
Or the faith.
And the faith ones.
Yeah, we could do that individually.
Absolutely.
We did used to have an assignment that you were meant to do. There was like a list and you had to pick.
Well, that was only Adult Social Care. I don't know whether the other committees have done that.
We used to do it in housing.
Well, it could well be now.
When I was first on the council, we did it, and I had to go to the Travellers site.
David Way.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I walked around there once.
So we did have it in the beginning in housing. A list of, and you chose which one you want, and then you went on it and you had to report back.
I think if I could just ask Mr. Chairman, in relation to fire safety, was it mentioned last time we might visit sites outside the borough as well, just to explore how they're taking it? And I think that would be a very good thing to do.
Absolutely. to compare and contrast
Yes.
type of work and safety and health and safety. Yes,
Exactly.
that's brilliant. Thank you. I think yes, we will probably have a list and visit different areas. Maybe perhaps a faith that's not yours, so that experience others how they do their worship and what they do in their places of worship. I certainly have enjoyed visiting the synagogue, and it was good to see the Jewish faith and how they do conduct when they're doing the worship and the Ten Commandments and everything. It's really good to see, and it's an eye opening because as a community, that's what holds us together. I think it's important to respect each other's faith as well as a good, healthy way of communities supporting each other. And they have played a very good role for the Grenfell and pandemic, and that housing communities should recognize what they were. So hopefully we will find the time to visit some of us the different places, or maybe if we can go, or can invite them all to a meeting that they can take part and recognize what they were. On that note, we move on to the next agenda item, that is any other business.